Welcome to HortTube. My name is Jim Putnam. Let's talk about daffodils. We have lots of daffodils in our garden here in Raleigh, North Carolina. We're in zone 7B. Most everybody watching can grow daffodils. There are daffodils that are hardy from zone 3 down to almost zone 9. It just depends on it is variety specific. So if you live in the deeper south area, we got most of the bulbs in our garden came from color blends, and they do a pretty good job. Really good quality bulbs, and they have a southern section on their daffodils if you want to take a look at that. And it's a southern section that includes some other bulbs that just perform well in the south. A lot of our bulbs like this need a little more cold in the winter than we have, in the south, especially deeper south than we are here in the middle of North Carolina, for sure. So look on there if you are in the deeper south for varieties. We're going to start this video. I think there's 10 or 11 different daffodils that are blooming currently. There are early, mid, and late daffodils, and so we're not going to ever get them all in the same video. There's some that are up and budding up, but not open yet, and several actually. So we may come back around to it in a tour video here in the garden. The first multi that we have, and by multi I mean there's multiple flowers per stem rather than having the one larger flower, and we'll see lots of those. There are lots of cultivars that have multiple different species that have multiple flowers on each stalk. This one is called Avalanche, and it's actually a very old variety, and it's very fragrant. I mean, it is really fragrant. It's late afternoon when we're filming this, and it's just filling the air with fragrance. This one came up really early, and it's gotten a little bit of frost or freeze damage on it. The daffodils are one of the early things. They're like the welcome to spring kind of flower. There are something like close to 30,000, maybe more than 30,000 named cultivars of daffodils. That's how many have been registered over the years. So our 10 is just a few of you can imagine just the incredible variety and how long humans have been working with these. So after I talked about all of the incredible introductions in daffodils over where humans have been working with them for a long time, here's an example of that. Here's one called Baby Boomer. And it is actually a cross between Avalanche, which again has been around for a long time, and another species of daffodil. And it created this almost grass-like foliage. And then those bright yellow flowers, probably 6 to 8 flowers on each of those. Small flowers, but quite showy. It's such a vivid yellow. Also another fragrant one. So it inherited the fragrance from Avalanche, but it has this almost grass-like foliage as it's coming out of the ground. One thing on the foliage on these daffodils, they need about 8 weeks after they finish flowering before you're cutting them back. So they'll start to die back to the ground after maybe 6 to 8 weeks. They're not necessarily the most attractive thing in the garden once they finish flowering, so we put them in our mixed perennial borders. So there's other things coming up around them. Other perennials are waking up, and so they'll come up, they'll flower, and rather than stand out as they're going to sleep and be brown and tired looking, other things are just going to kind of swallow this space up over time. I'm probably standing on a couple of those now actually. So the next one we'll talk about here is Early Cheer. This one, they're a little bit past, and so you're looking at, again, early, mid, and late. This one's considered a mid, but it opened very early in our landscape. It has a lot of flowers, as many as 12 or so doubles, and they're kind of a creamy white with a little bit of a yellow center on them. The yellow has kind of faded away at this point. Very fragrant. Lots and lots. This thing is super showy, and as a group like this, it looks like a carnation. It's just really an outstanding variety. All 3 of the ones I've shown you so far are very heat tolerant. They're on that heat tolerant list on Color Blend's website. They're not as cold tolerant as some others, but quite very heat tolerant. Next up is one called Kedron, and we have a lot of these. We have a lot of these planted around the vegetable garden space in the back garden. Really reliable one called Kedron. And perfect two-tone combo. This really dark orange center. Not the biggest daffodil flower in the world, but it's one of the showiest. And it has, You know, where we showed you over there, the multis, this one has a tendency to have more than one flower on it. So there's one coming up right there that has 3 flowers, another one opening up right here that has at least 2, maybe 3, and then you'll see singles on them as well. Thin foliage on this one. This one is very fragrant and almost really perfumey fragrance on it. And several of the ones that I've talked about so far, when I say fragrant, I mean, you know, almost perfumey. These like moist, kind of well-drained conditions. So they don't like the driest places in the world, but they certainly don't want wet spaces either. You will get some root rot on them. They are pretty much animal proof. They are actually poisonous to animals. Animals don't eat them, so don't worry about it. You know, don't worry about it. But animals know it somehow to not eat them. But the deer don't eat them. The rabbits don't eat them. The squirrels don't dig them up. So if you have those kinds of problems, great kind of intro thing into bulbs because they're the most reliable. They take the least amount of cold to come up every year. And again, you want to pick ones that are definitely hardy in your area. Again, from zone 3 down to 9. But Kedron is one of our favorites and probably the one we have the most of in the landscape. There's one here called Gigantic Star. And this, just to put this in perspective here, you know, my hand is pretty good size, and this thing is at least 4 inches across. One thing I want you to see is these are facing away from us, okay? You want to think about your daffodil planting, they will face east and slightly south, okay? So literally these are facing southeast. I had one flower on the Kedron that was facing back toward the camera there. The other ones are facing away and are definitely going to be leaning that direction. And so we plant these typically, except for this group, where they're going to be facing the border over there. So think about that as you're planting them. You'll get one that's turned around a different direction like this one is. But for the most part, they're going to want to get that sunlight on them, and they're blooming at a time of the year when the sun is kind of tracking south. It's coming up in the east and setting in the west like it always does, but it's tracking in the south. Gigantic Star, absolutely fantastic. Big, giant bulbs. These are, again, from color blends, and the bulb is, you know, bigger than others. You can already tell before this thing comes up, and it is vanilla scented. And it is an incredible fragrance. It's not, you got to get up and smell this one. It's not going to perfume the landscape. But if you get up and smell it, it smells like vanilla. Here's an example of an area to plant your daffodils. This is the north property line here. And they're all facing, again, they're all facing south. So if you put them on this side, they're all facing you. You can see every single one of these ice follies lined up in this area. There's actually some species tulips coming up, and we're going to do a video on our species tulips as well. That's Lady Jane blooming in the background. They bloom over a pretty long period of time, the 5 different ones that we have. And so I can't do that video all at once, so we definitely won't have them all. So we're just taking photos of them, and then we'll talk through. But we love our species tulips out here. So ice follies, been around for a long time, and it's everywhere. This is one you definitely see quite a bit of, always reliable. Zones 3 to 8, almost everybody watching can grow this one. Starts off with a really bright yellow center, and it fades in time. I've seen the bees working these today. This is another example here where it looks like this is probably going to look rough once they finish flowering and they start fading away. But we have lots of perennials planted in this border, and so things are just going to come up right through the middle of them. These blueberries are going to continue to leaf out. Hydrangea over here is going to leaf out. There's a rose that's been cut back over here. Things are just going to come up right up through the middle of them and kind of make this foliage disappear. These need 6 to 8 hours of direct sun, but keep in mind, you can put them under deciduous shade, we would call it, because they can come up in the winter time and bloom under those trees and finish flowering and be passed before your trees leaf out. So if you have a good bright area, you're measuring the sunlight in the winter, okay? So keep that in mind. But they do need a good amount of direct sun, and then again, they need that period of time after they bloom to recharge and re-energize that bulb for next year, you know, to come up and do the same thing. They really don't need any additional fertilizer. If your soil's pretty good, they like slightly acidic soil, We keep this area mulched. We do fertilize our entire beds once a year with an organic fertilizer, but I'm not necessarily targeting these specifically. I'm just fertilizing everything with a small amount of organic fertilizer, and then the mulch breaking down is plenty. And then the sunlight they're gathering right now is plenty for them to rebuild for next year. We put in a border of these gigantic stars on the north side of the fence. It's in the chain link fence. It's in the back garden. This is the first year they're in the ground, so they're not quite as big as they will be in the future, but the flowers are still like 4 inches across. You can see them all the way across the garden. Again, they're on that north side, so they're facing back in this direction into the garden. We also have some tete-a-tetes along that north border as well, but they have finished. Tete-a-tete's a little dwarf one, very small, one of the first signs of spring every year. The beautiful one to let naturalize in that dappled, sunlight kind of space. They've got a big group of them over at the Ralston. It's one of my favorite things to see every February is this big field of tete-a-tete daffodils. This one ranks pretty high up the list of our favorite daffodil. This one's called Tompas. That pale yellow with the apricot center on it. Super, super showy. Very lightly fragrant, if at all. Very reliable. These have been in the ground for, this is the second season for these coming up, and you can see I can see on the edge here, you got little bulblets that will bloom, probably that next year. So if you want to divide or move your daffodils, you'll do that toward the end of the season as they're retreating back under the ground. And so these are blooming now, and in about 6 to 8 weeks, again, that foliage will start to die back. And right when it's pretty much all the way died back, but you can still find them easily and not cut them up with your shovel trying to stab at them later, you can pop them out of the ground and move them and almost abuse them. I've taken daffodils out of the ground before and then accidentally left them in a container with no soil on them for months and then put them in the ground and they came back up. Not saying you should do that, definitely not do that. But they are incredibly easy to move, relocate, divide. When you pop them out of the ground, if they've been there for a long time, they'll have little bulblets on the side of them you can break off. And again, we have a ton. This video we're shooting here, this is probably the most we're gonna have open at one time, but we have a lot of late daffodils out here as well that haven't started blooming yet. So here's one of the later ones. This one's called Pink Charm. Only have a couple flowers open on these so far, but we have lots of them in the garden. It's just, it looks like just the end of that cup was almost dipped in an apricot color, and then the rest of it is that kind of pale yellow. Very, very striking. Very heat tolerant, but also cold tolerant. This one is a zone 3 to 8 one, and again, it's a little later blooming in the season. That's something we would encourage you to do. But if you're going to have lots of different daffodils, there are early ones, mid ones, and late ones. And if you have them, if you have those 3 different ones, you can really extend the season. What seems like a very short season of daffodils, if you were to come into this garden, is a very, very long season of daffodils, because we have them blooming from beginning of February until probably almost May, just depending on how quickly it gets hot. A lot of people call these Narcissus, or they'll call them Jonquils. That Kedron variety that I showed you earlier is Narcissus jonquilla, and so that's where that jonquil comes from. It's one of the species of Narcissus or daffodils, and so they're not all jonquils, but you will hear them. Common names are Narcissus, jonquils, daffodils, lots of different names for them. Planting time will kind of depend on where you are. You can plant them probably pretty early in the fall in northern areas, and a little later in the fall in the south. If you order from Color Blends, they'll actually ship them to you at the time that it's time for them to go in the ground, so you don't have to really think about it a whole lot. We do get a lot of bulbs from them. They're quality bulbs. They don't pay me anything for this, but they are pretty quality bulbs. When you're picking out bulbs, make sure they're firm. They have a good papery cover on them, on these daffodils, and so we get good bulbs from them. That's why we use them. The last thing I'll say about them before I introduce you to probably our favorite daffodil in this garden is the informal planting. So we have them just here and there, throughout the garden. There's nothing formal about them. They're not in little straight rows. They're in groupings, but there's other things planted in and around them, and so that we don't, again, they spend a brief period of time in flower, and then they spend that time, with the foliage, before it goes dormant. So we try to have, perennials filling in that space at the same time. So The last one I'll introduce you to in this video, this one's called Tahiti, and it's an amazing double bicolor flower. It's a heavy flower because it's a double, but it has the heavy stems on it to hold them up big and tall. These are the second year in the ground. This is the only flower that's fully open so far. Incredibly showy. When this group completely opens up here in the next week or so, this will be just incredibly showy. We have several groups of these throughout the garden. And again, big, sturdy, strong plants that come back big and strong each year. We'll, after about 3 or 4 years in the ground, we will pop them out of the ground and divide them, spread the love somewhere else into another garden, probably. But again, this is Tahiti, one of our absolute favorites. So you can see the wide variety between the multi-flowered ones out front with little teeny tiny flowers, but lots of them, up to giants like that gigantic star, that we showed you. This Tahiti with the multi-colored and just an incredible range of daffodils. And again, I just love that little bright, happy thing in the garden that happens so early in the season before your shrubs and trees and other things are waking up. So thank you guys for watching.